Hello, we're here in Canberra, in Australian National University with Anna Wierzbicka. My name is James Underhill. I work with the Rouen Ethnolinguistics project in France. Anna, the idea that certain concepts are universal stems a little in part due to the fact we're in a post-colonial period and we're trying to revise prejudice, get beyond prejudice. And Anglophones often wish to respect human complexity of other cultures, the cultures throughout the world. But beyond that, below this is this idea of being fair to different cultures. You've already criticized the idea of fairness as being a universal. What I'm interested in here is that the concepts that seem to us not simply concepts like any others, but the concepts with which we investigate other concepts. You published in 2010 an interesting book. It was a thought-provoking book called Experience, Evidence and Sense. Now these seem to me as someone working within European language to be like words that we can translate, or there are translations for those words, but you call that the hidden cultural legacy of English. That was published by Oxford University Press 2010. In that book you contest the idea that these key concepts that are used in science, in empirical investigation, experience, sense and experience, you contest that these are universals. Can you give us some idea of your conclusions in that book?
Oh, I think that words like, in particular, evidence and sense, that there are Anglo concepts these words embody Anglo concepts which don't have equivalents in other languages. There are various false friends, like sens in French, for example. But I think, as I tried to show in that book which you mentioned, these words are used in a particular sense in English, and this is a terribly important word in English, this sense, moral sense, for example. There is no moral sense in other languages, because sense brings some kind of, bodily perspective into thinking about what is good and bad. For example, combination of thinking with bodily experience. It's very much to do with the Anglo tradition of hand and eye, the empirical tradition. And of course the word empirical is a prime example of this tradition. Empirical, in English, if you want to get a grant, you apply, you say that's an empirical research. Whereas in French, your word empirique, I've showed many examples of this, and so has my colleague Bert Peters. You can put things down by saying it's empirique, because you value theory much more in the French cultural world. So empiric is not necessarily good, whereas in modern English, empirical is very good because it's based on thinking and knowing and the senses and the body, experiments with hands-on.
And do you see that as part of the English pragmatic empirical tradition that's expressed in philosophy, but not simply in philosophy? I think
in language.
It's in language.
Absolutely embedded in language.
In one sense, you would probably agree with Sapir that philosophy is an extrapolation from language, and that
often. Yes, yeah. Also, philosophers can have different views, but language has a view which is shared by all speakers of the language, because they usually don't think about it. It's unconscious. It's built into the language they use.
Okay, but say for example that we have a crime or something in English, we look for evidence of the crime.
Yeah,
are there no universals for evidence there? Or
no, evidence is an English concept. There's no word for evidence in Russian, for example. Well, I claim that there's no word for evidence in French, as I try to show, because in the French evidence still has a link with something which is evident, manifest. Everybody can see it. As I try to show, it's used very differently, but essentially what is valued more in the French cultural tradition is le preuve, proofs, and evidence is often translated into French as preuve, whereas in English there's a huge difference between proofs, which you find in mathematics, and evidence, which you expect to find in empirical science.
Okay, so the idea is we're putting evidence into the objective world that we can come in contact with. Proof would
with
be
your
part
hands,
of
with your iron hand.
The act of proving logical,
well, not
rational.
proving, you can't prove anything outside mathematics and logic from an Anglo point of view, but you can provide evidence, which means this also linked with the concept of data, something that you can show and that many people can think it is reasonable to think that it might be so, or something like that.
Okay, that leads me back to sense. I mean, sense is a difficult word, as you mentioned. They're very different in French. Sens would also mean the direction. So we're directing the sort of the sens de quelque chose. Would be directing someone in a certain direction. Jürgen Habermas has a lovely word that he talks about, the Sprachsinn, the sense of language. But this is a specific Humboldtian German concept that will translate differently into the different language, perhaps. For the people that we've worked with together, Karsten Levesons, for example, will argue that there's a lot of humour studies because the sense of humour is an Anglo concept here, that if we break this down into your semantic, not primes, or into units, your building blocks, are you arguing that sense and humour are both Anglo concepts?
So I am. And the complex concept of sense of humor is a very Anglo concept, and I discuss it in this book which you mentioned. It's a huge Anglo value, as I mentioned before. You know, I studied English obituaries in England and in America, and you praise people above all for a great sense of humor. You wouldn't find it, for example, in any Polish obituaries, and I think in other European languages either, but in English you do. It's the combination.
So there's two concepts, cultural concepts, and the combination of the concepts would be there. Okay, that leads us to the various approaches that are happening within your school. Can we divide the NSM approach, or the NSM school, into perhaps 3 levels, with ethnosemantics and with ethnopragmatics, and then culture at a more general level? Would you be happy with that kind of distinction?
I don't think so. I think there's the same methodology which people apply in different areas.
Okay. I'm simply in terms of when you're trying to get down to, are you reducing something to a semantic primer into an atom or a building block would be a little different from the pragmatics of sense of humour, how sense of humour is used, how it's practiced, how it's learned in society.
Well, possibly, but I would start with a lexical, trying to understand the meaning of these words.
Okay.
And you understand the meaning of these words by breaking them down into simpler concepts and ultimately into primes.
So it's ultimately an analytic method, would you agree with that? Or is it a synthetic method, or the two work together?
I don't know what you want to call it. But you know, it's a methodology which can be used for anything.
Okay.
So you can also use it for trying to investigate, and we've done a lot of it, so-called cultural scripts. Norms which are implicit, not just words and not just grammatical constructions, but tacit norms that people internalize and live with, and you can explicate those too in the same shared simple human concepts.
So if you were going to translate concepts with sense into Polish, or could we talk about equivalent concepts in Polish? How would you break them down to express something like the sense of duty, a sens de devoir?
Yeah, duty itself is a very Anglo concept, and which I've also analyzed, compared. I have a paper in the journal called Common Knowledge, comparing the English concept of duty with the German concept of Pflicht, and how this links with a whole sort of broad field of other important cultural concepts. And actually, duty is sort of on the way out in English. People now, as I try to show, responsibilities. That's what people are called. Kids are taught at school now, to value of responsibility.
Responsibility, transparency, and duty is
responsibility. Yeah, you have. But no, duty. Duty sounds to many people now like a sort of old-fashioned idea.
That's probably true of devoir as well. Is that related to the citizens' values? Here we're talking about we're moving into a world where we want, or at least we're trying to generate what we talk about, and we're going to have to negotiate this as well, global human values, human rights. These are universalizing, universalist sort of terms. We're going to need some kind of universal concept, or to find some kind of universal concept for law in the world. That's going to cause a lot of problems for us.
But don't look for any abstract nouns when you want to find your universal concepts. That's precisely what I was quoting before. Like, for example, it is good if someone wants to do good things for other people. That's a universal value, I think. But I don't put an abstract noun on it. You just have to use a sentence. It is bad if you want to do bad things to other people. Universal value, expressed totally in universal primes, but in a sentence.
I can see that what you say is interesting about the way values. Here we're talking about words, but words that are rooted in values within worldviews. And you seem, when you say that duty seems to be going out of fashion, devoir is probably going out of fashion as well. Some people will argue that the problem with citizens today is that they want rights but not the responsibilities of citizenship. That takes us back to a key word that you really studied a lot in the 1980s, which was Ojczyzna, the homeland, which is very difficult to translate into German, Heimat.
Very impossible.
Heimat and the Vaterland are going to have very political histories which will be treated differently during the difficult period of the 30s, but also treated differently later. We've worked on that, and our shared friend Jerzy Wierzbicka, he's worked a lot on those questions. How do you see those words developing? Ojczyzna, citizen value, do you see these as part of an ideological worldview that's changing?
I think so. So you can find out a lot about the changing culture by studying the semantic history of these words. Not only whether they are becoming less common, but also how the meaning changes. And Vaterland, Vaterland was a terribly important culture keyword in German.
In the 19th century, right?
Well, 19th century and in 20th century too. But since World War II, of course, people don't avoid it, and for obvious reasons.
In this sense, would you argue that your approach, my impression is one of the strengths of your work, not necessarily the NSM work, but your work personally, is that it comes from a semantics tradition, a strong Polish tradition, but also a philological tradition. In your earlier books, a little less the case now, but in your earlier books, you were quoting a lot of poems, a lot of songs, a lot of text. Is that an important dimension of NSM research?
I don't know. It's important aspect of part of NSM research, but generally literature is a huge resource. If you want to find out how people think and how they talk, you have to look at literature. You can't look at isolated words or even sentences invented by people, as transformational grammarians often do. So colorless green ideas. What do they do? Furiously, something or other. I mean, you invent. No, you look at language,
so
and
you believe
especially
in going
in
back
literature.
to text, into
Absolutely, and I still do it a lot.
No, that's clear. That's clear in your approach. That's a strength that has to be preserved, to my mind. But it is interesting that this is part of a linguistic tradition that Chomsky isn't particularly radical when he does this. English dictionaries do invent things in a way that French dictionaries don't tend to invent things. They tend to work more with literature. So for you, literature and linguistics is something that shouldn't ignore each other.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you, James. Thank you.